Rain hung over Seoul like a thin gray net, and Kang Doyun guided his delivery scooter between buses as if one careless turn could cost them the last order of the night. Dinner cooled in the plastic box behind him, meant for another family, while his phone trembled in his pocket with a reminder about Nayeon's hospital bill. At a red light, he pulled off one glove with his teeth and brushed his thumb across the screen where a short message from his sister glowed. Nayeon wrote that she had eaten and was going to bed, though Doyun knew only rice porridge and bitter-smelling medicine waited for her at home again. Above the intersection, a huge screen showed a smiling hunter from the Chenmu Guild, wrapped in light and advertising slogans. Doyun looked up for only a moment, then fixed his eyes on the wet road again, because legendary raids and shining ranks had always taken place somewhere far above his own life. Their cramped apartment flashed through Doyun's mind, with Nayeon's school uniform drying near the window and a hospital-stamped envelope lying on the table. Since their parents had died in the first rift, Doyun had learned to count days not by a calendar, but by the amount he could earn before the next deadline. When the red light turned green, the street beneath his wheels gave a faint tremor and circles spread across the rain puddles. People at the bus stop raised their heads almost together, as though something enormous had dragged a finger across the glass dome of the sky. Over central Seoul, a tower rose, so deeply black that signs and windows dimmed around it. It did not fall from the sky or climb out of the earth. It simply appeared where clouds had been a second earlier, as though the city had suddenly remembered a shadow that did not belong to it. The shockwave moved down the avenue softly, almost without sound, yet Doyun's scooter skidded and collapsed near the curb. His ears rang, and above the rooftops a transparent dome began to unfold, catching the rain and turning every falling drop into a white spark. A window appeared before his eyes with even letters, foreign and yet understandable like an emergency exit sign. Similar frames flared around the pedestrians, and every person, from a schoolboy to an elderly bus driver, briefly looked like an item that had been tagged for sorting. Doyun reached for his phone, because his first thought was not about the tower, but about his sister 30 minutes away. His fingers nearly touched the wet screen with her photo on it when white light opened beneath his feet and wiped away the noise of the street. He struck his shoulder not against asphalt, but a smooth, white floor, cold like a hospital tile. All around him people fell, screamed, clutched bags and children, while ahead stretched an armory hall where hundreds of pedestals shone in different colors, each light promising power to whoever reached it first. A massive system window hung above the hall, its light reflected in frightened faces so evenly that fear itself seemed part of the interface. The title line slowly formed the words "Arc Selection," and beneath it a countdown began, measuring the time remaining before each person had to choose a starting item. At first, people stood stunned, but the first shout about a legendary weapon tore them loose. The crowd surged toward the pedestals, shoulders crashing into shoulders, someone falling underfoot, and Doyun arose too late, holding his bruised arm against his chest while the brightest lights were already being claimed. At the brightest pedestal stood a young man with the face of an advertisement hero, and a golden spear settled into his palm by itself. Cheonmu Guild armor unfolded over his clothes in shining plates, and those nearby stepped back, recognizing him as someone the system had chosen to smile upon first. A little aside, a girl with dark blue hair chose not a weapon, but thin, floating pages covered with moving lines. When she touched them, cyan light flared in her eyes, and several nearby players immediately turned toward her for explanations she did not yet have. Doyun pushed forward between elbows and backs, feeling the selection shrink into leftovers with every passing second. By the time he reached the final row, most of the glow had vanished, and on a low stone pedestal lay a small cracked shield, dull enough to look misplaced among the relics. The shield looked as if someone had dragged it from the trash of an old dungeon and forgotten to wipe off the dust. A diagonal crack crossed its surface, and the system window showed a miserable F rank with a durability line that dried Doyun's mouth the moment he read it. Its durability was 1, its defense showed 0, and any reasonable person would have stepped away from such an item. Yet, beneath those numbers trembled a line labeled reflection, where 3 question marks stood in place of a value, and that error held Doyun's fingers above the cold metal. Laughter rose behind him, and Doyun felt dozens of gazes stick to his hand. Ji-hyuk turned with the golden spear resting on his shoulder, his amber eyes sliding over the shield, his expression becoming the kind wealthy people wore when noticing loose change lying beside a road. There was almost nothing left to choose, and the countdown above the hall slipped into the final seconds. Doyun gripped the shield strap, and the metal proved heavier than it looked. At the same time, a system mark wound around his wrist in a pale gray ring. Unlike the laughing players, the girl with the floating maps did not look away. Sora stared not at the crack, but at the faded description window, as though she had caught a movement inside it that did not match the ordinary logic of items. When the final item was chosen, the White Hall shuddered and began to rearrange itself with frightening smoothness. The pedestal sank into the floor, the walls climbed higher, and dark gates opened ahead, releasing a damp smell of soil and blood into the shining armory. The owners of swords and staffs began testing stances, though most held their weapons as if they were props for a photo shoot. Doyun raised the shield before his chest and felt the strap scrape his wrist, while the crack in the metal answered with a faint coldness. Among the crowd stood a broad-shouldered man in an old firefighter jacket, paying no attention to ranks as he lifted those who had been shoved down. His system axe glowed only modestly, yet his movements were calm, familiar with smoke, panic, and the weight of strangers in his arms. At the edge of the formation, a small girl with violet-tipped hair neatly slipped a token from someone's pocket and hid it in her sleeve. Rin smiled with one corner of her mouth, yet her eyes stayed tense, because in this new world, even theft looked like a way to buy one more minute alive. Above the gates, the notice for the first trial flared, and red light passed over the crowd like a blade. The system demanded that participants survive until the next zone opened, while the small print beneath it clarified that a participant's death would not count as a violation of the rules. The gates opened wider, and claws rattled across the white floor. Low gray-skinned creatures burst out in jerks, their bone knives shining with sticky moisture, while the faces of players who had been arguing about ranks moments before suddenly became equally lost. The first owner of a shining sword charged toward the monsters, but his wide swing passed above the target. A goblin ducked beneath the blade, struck his thigh, and the bright A-rank weapon clattered onto the floor beside a man who had not yet learned how to use his own legend. A magic staff fired into the ceiling, a spear struck an ally, and someone screamed so loudly the sound became part of the chaos. Doyun backed towards the wall with the shield raised, realizing his body remembered only carrying deliveries up staircases, not fighting creatures from a dungeon. One goblin turned its head towards him, and its yellow eyes narrowed with simple animal calculation. Doyun took a step back, struck the wall with his heel, and held out the shield so awkwardly that the strap nearly slipped from his sweating hand. The creature leapt, tucking its legs beneath its thin body, and the bone knife drove straight towards his throat. Time did not stop, yet Doyun felt every jerk of his heart, every inch of cold metal before his face, and the tremble of the crack as though it were waiting for impact. The knife struck the shield, and its single point of durability vanished not as a number, but as the sound of metal tearing apart. Silver fragments burst before Doyun's face, and in that instant he had enough time to fear that the item truly had been garbage. Then the force returned. The goblin was hurled backward as sharply as if an unseen hand had seized its chest and driven its own leap back through the air. The monster flew several meters and struck the floor with a crack that froze the nearest players in place. In Doyun's hand, the shield lay whole again, as whole as an item already marked by an old crack could be. Beside it, a new thin line had appeared, and the system window trembled, showing for a heartbeat a reflection multiplier of 10. Sora saw it not as a spectacle, but as a flaw in the record. Her floating pages opened by themselves, their lines moving faster, and she frowned slightly when the battle log skipped the most important moment, as if the system had deliberately closed its eyes. Ji-Huk finished another goblin with a shining thrust and turned towards the noise. His confident smile still remained on his face, but his gaze cooled when he saw the courier with the F-rank shield standing where another weak victim should have been lying. Doyun did not feel victory. His shoulder burned, his fingers cramped, and a hollow fear trembled inside his chest because the blow had not passed through the shield, yet his body still remembered how close death had come. The window before him unfolded with a delay, as though reluctantly admitting the result. A new line appeared in the item list, Echo Acquired, and beneath it flashed the name Goblin Rush, bound not to Doyun's body, but to the first fresh crack on the shield. The man in the firefighter jacket noticed how Doyun held the shield after the impact and raised a hand toward the group of weaker players. It was not a command, more the practiced movement of someone who in a burning building always searched for those standing closest to the smoke. Doyun took one step, then another, and the crowd parted before him with the same awkwardness it had used to laugh a minute earlier. No one tried to take the shield from him now, though the item still looked pitiful beside the shining weapons of the others. After the first wave, the arena floor opened into a passage leading to a gray corridor with a low ceiling. The system gave no time to mourn the dead. Arrows on the walls lit green, and the survivors moved forward, driven by fear of the next countdown. Doyun ended up beside Sora and Myung-soo almost by accident, because walking alone after what they had seen felt foolish. The girls' floating pages drew a thin map of the corridor, but some areas blurred into white stains, as though the tower reserved the right to change the path. Ren moved several steps ahead, touching the floor with the tip of a knife and listening for clicks behind the walls. Her light-footed walk irritated the armed players, but the first hidden spike shot out exactly where she had stopped, and their irritation quickly turned into hungry attention. While the group paused at the trap, Doyun lowered his gaze to the shield. In the new crack, the bent shadow of a goblin flickered for a moment and his arm twitched forward by itself, repeating the rush that had nearly opened his throat. The shield dragged him forward, and Doyun slammed shoulder first into the wall before he could stop himself. Stone dust fell into his hair. Several players laughed more quietly than before, and Myung-soo came closer to check carefully whether the young man had dislocated his arm. The laughter ended when a heavy scraping sound came from the far end of the corridor. From the mist emerged a tall monster with long claws, and at his feet lay the owner of an A-rank sword, his armor cut so cleanly it looked open by a surgical tool. Ji-Huk stepped forward, and the golden spear lengthened in his hand, gathering heat. The people behind him exhaled in relief, because they wanted to believe in a simple picture of the world, where S-ranked weapons always won, and an F-rank shield belonged in the back. The spear struck in a golden arc, cutting through the mist and the stone behind it. The elite monster moved half a step back, letting the tip pass beside his chest, then answered with claws so quickly that the spear's light seemed like lightning arriving too late. A thin red line appeared across Ji-Huk's cheek. The wound was shallow, yet his expression changed more than it might have after a true injury. For a man used to being first, bleeding before a crowd because of a monster felt almost like a personal insult. Myung-soo moved two trembling players behind him and widened his stance. Doyun noticed his movement and copied it a moment late, feeling the shield become more steady when it no longer hung before his chest like a panicked piece of metal. The monster suddenly changed direction and slipped past the spear towards those standing behind. Doyun did not see the entire rush, only the first turn of its shoulder, yet that was enough for his body to react before thought and step into the narrow gap between claws and people. The claws bit into the shield with a vile screech, and the metal tore apart before his face again. This time, Doyun did not retreat immediately. His knees shook, his teeth clenched painfully, and he held the direction of the blow, as Myung-soo had shown him minutes earlier. The reflection returned the claws to their owner, and 4 deep lines opened across the monster's chest. The shield restored itself with a heavy jolt into Doyun's palm, and beside the first fresh line, a new crack lit up sinuous and reddish, as though the metal had remembered the wound's shape. A new window appeared over the old one, announcing Claw Rebound as an acquired echo. Doyun barely read the name because his wrist felt caught in heated iron, and the pain of the reflected attack rolled through his arm only after the danger had passed. The gazes that had clung to the golden spear now turned toward the cracked shield. Ji-Hyuk said nothing, but the shaft of Sunpiercer creaked beneath his fingers, and the golden flame at the spearhead flared more sharply. The wounded monster did not die, but backed into the mist, leaving dark drops on the floor. The corridor ahead split in two, and Sora's pages showed two different routes for the first time, one straight and bright, the other narrow, ending in a white stain instead of a destination. The stronger players quickly chose the lit route behind Ji-hyuk because it looked like the road to a reward. Myung-soo paused at the fork, looked at those limping and clutching wounds, then turned into the narrow passage where Sora saw less data but a better chance of avoiding the elite. In the cramped passage, the shield kept scraping the wall, and every rasp echoed through his teeth. Doyun walked nearly sideways, letting the wounded move ahead, and kept thinking the useless item took up too much space until he heard another frightened breath behind him. Rin stopped so abruptly that the person behind almost crashed into her back. Beneath the dust, runes emerged, and when her knife touched one line, small holes woke inside the walls, aimed exactly where the feet of running people would have been. Sora crouched beside her and spread the pages just above the floor. The map line settled carefully over the runes, and Doyun noticed the white stain on the route pulsing in the same rhythm as the reflection crack on his shield. Behind them came the familiar scrape of claws. The wounded elite monster had found their path and was now moving through the narrow passage where the shield was difficult to turn and the weaker players had almost no room left to retreat. Myung-soo placed his palm on the shield's edge and turned it by a few degrees. Doyun felt the difference at once. The metal no longer treated the corridor like a prison, but became part of the wall, blocking the passage not through size, but through angle. When the monster struck, Doyun did not meet the claws head-on. The shield cracked at an angle, the reflection veered sideways, and the creature's own attack struck the trap runes, forcing the walls to fire spikes into the one pursuing the group. The monster roared and thrashed in the passage while the spikes held it like hooks. Doyun dropped to one knee because along with the reflection, a brief alien rush seemed to enter him, and his leg muscles were still trying to run where he had already stopped. Sora helped him stand and studied the item window, which had managed to blink before closing. In the reflection line, a new angle parameter appeared, but the number blurred immediately, leaving the sense that the shield was learning faster than the system allowed itself to display. The passage led them into a round chamber where murky water seeped from a cracked fountain. Bones of old monsters were embedded in the walls, and at the center lay a chest with a green seal, far too visible and calm for a place built around traps. Rin had already reached for the seal when Myung-soo caught the back of her jacket and pulled her sharply away. From the fountain arose a serpent-like creature with transparent fangs, and drops of its saliva burned the stone where the girl's fingers had been a second earlier. The serpent lunged low, aiming not for a throat but for the exposed ankle of the nearest wounded player. Doyun managed to drop the shield almost to the floor, and the fangs sank into the metal with a wet click, after which the crack across its surface glowed poisonous green. The venom returned into the creature's mouth, and the transparent fangs blackened from within. Doyun tasted bitterness, though no drop had touched his skin, and the shield restored itself slowly, as if digesting the creature's death together with its venom. Venom reversal appeared in the echo list. Sora traced the air beside the window with her finger and noticed that the skill had not been recorded as protection from poison, but as the return of the poisoning cause to its source. The rest lasted only a few minutes, yet during that time the group's gaze changed. Doyun was no longer the man with a trash item. They looked at him the way people look at a door in a burning building, when there might still be air beyond it. The chest proved real, though the reward was modest. Several cloudy potions, trial tokens, and bandages smelling of medicinal herbs. Rin counted everything twice before Myung-soo silently placed part of the potions before the wounded, forcing her to hide her displeasure under a quick shrug. Sora's map trembled, and the bright path chosen by Ji-hyuk turned an alarming red. The narrow route, however, revealed a hidden exit toward the next zone, and she looked at Doyun as though his accidental choice of shield had begun changing not only battles, but the road itself. As they moved toward the exit, screams and crashes sounded more often beyond the wall. Doyun recognized in those sounds not weakness, but the wrong kind of confidence from people who received beautiful weapons and decided they had also received a finished right to survive. Near the exit, the stone wall suddenly split and Jihook's players emerged through the breach, far more battered than their admirers had expected. The Chenmu heir held himself upright, but dark traces of blood stained his white gold armor before his cloak could hide them. Between the two groups lay the same elite monster, finished by spikes and its own claws. Jihook saw the green crack on the shield, then the faces of the rescued weaker players, and his smile returned too quickly, like a mask pressed onto wet skin. The system summarized the battle in dry light. Points for killing the elite monster flowed not toward the golden spear, but toward the cracked shield, because the final registered cause of death belonged to the reflected attack. Whispers moved through the players faster than the reward window could close. To most, it was a strange result. To Jihook, it was a stain on the flawless story he had been building since the moment he chose Sunpiercer. Doyun received a trial token and barely noticed its weight. The shield strap had rubbed the skin of his wrist raw, and that new pain felt more honest in the reward, because at least it explained why he was still standing. Myungsu silently wrapped Doyun's wrist in a bandage, tying the knot firmly but carefully. Sora watched the cracks during that time, and her fingers sometimes paused over the map when the lines on the shield matched the fractures in the route. The door to the first safe zone opened not like a reward, but like a temporary delay. The blue light beyond smelled of clean water and warmed stone, and people entered with the greed of those who had already understood that rest inside the tower was also part of the trial. The safe zone resembled an underground station made for people who had stood under Seoul's reign not long ago. Stone benches lined the walls, trading windows floated in the air, and above each player shimmered a status marker too bright for their exhausted faces. Doyun sat at the edge of a bench and placed the shield at his feet, expecting to see his face in the dull metal. Instead, the surface showed the cracks larger than they truly were, as if the item saw not its owner, but the blows that made it useful. Sora sat across from him and spread the pages so their light fell over the shield. On the map, a small gray marker labeled Aegis 0 appeared, and beside it pulsed a white stain that refused to become a clear description. Rin settled nearby with someone else's ration and pretended that only food interested her. In truth, she was counting the gazes around Doyun and quickly understood that the cracked shield had become loot people were not yet brave enough to touch. Jihook gathered the owners of the best items around him, and the safe zone split along an invisible line. Those who wanted a future under the protection of the strong approached the golden spear, while those who had already seen the strong turn their backs in the corridors stayed closer to Myungsu. A rule board opened on the wall of the zone, and several lines immediately stirred the crowd. System duels were permitted even inside a safe zone if both sides had a dispute over a reward, and the loser could forfeit an item, tokens, or the right to the next route. Jihyuk approached Doyun's bench so smoothly that it seemed the stage had already formed around him. His supporters followed, shaping a half circle, and the air of the safe zone suddenly felt crowded with other people's expectation of humiliation. Doyun did not rise at once because his legs still remembered the corridor and the impacts. When he finally stood, the shield hung from his bandaged arm, his gray hoodie was torn at the shoulder, and his dirty sneakers looked almost absurd beside the golden armor. Jihyuk indicated the reward from the elite monster, and the system immediately shaped the dispute into a cold window. A red frame settled around Aegis 0, offering the shield as the contested item, as though the story of Doyun's survival were merely an error in point distribution. Sora tried to interfere through her map, but the red frame repelled her cyan lines with a sharp discharge. She pulled her hand back, and the white mark on her neck flashed so quickly that Doyun noticed only the shadow of pain in her clenched fingers. The safe zone floor opened into a duel circle, and the benches slid toward the walls, carrying half-drunk potions and scraps of food with them. Blue light turned red, and the duel rules hung so low above their heads that they felt like the lid of a trap. On one side of the arena stood the Chonmu heir with a spear that lit his armor like a small sun. On the other stood a courier with a cracked shield, too exhausted for a graceful stance, yet experienced enough now to hold the metal's edge at the proper angle. Myung-soo remained at the arena boundary because the rules would not let him cross the line. Rin vanished into the crowd, but Doyun caught her reflection on the shield, green eyes moving over the spectators, searching for anyone who might strike from behind while everyone watched the spear. Ji-hyuk began without pause, and his first thrust was faster than anything Doyun had seen in the corridor. The shield rose almost by itself, the strap biting into the wound at his wrist, and the golden spearhead struck the metal with enough force to shake the floor beneath them. Aegis Zero shattered, but the reflection did not return straight into Ji-hyuk's chest. Doyun managed to turn the shield's edge, and the golden force slid aside, cutting a long glowing trench across the arena stone that made the spectators recoil. When the shield restored itself, a silver rim moved along its edge. The 10th crack settled between the red and green lines, and for a moment the item became heavier, as though an unseen lock had turned somewhere inside it. The rank window flared before Doyun. F changed into D, and the item name became Cracked Aegis. The crowd stirred, but the noise reached him dimly, because in that moment he felt not joy, but the frightening movement of a shield that seemed to have awakened deeper. Ji-hyuk's golden eyes flared together with the spear. He was no longer performing for the crowd. Every new ray around Sunpiercer grew sharper, and his steps lost their practiced smoothness, turning into a real hunt for the man who had ruined the scene. The next thrust never began. The ceiling of the safe zone cracked with a long rumble. The red dual line flickered, and every player raised their head at once as black dust poured from the fracture above. A massive clawed paw broke through the ceiling, crushing the arena edge and the trading window beside it. The blue safe light went out, as if someone had torn the zone's heart away, and the system rule board hung like a blank white slab. Through the breach forced its way the first floor boss, a horned beast with a bone mass and a chest covered in black plates. Its arrival did not cancel the duel, and the rule windows overlapped, turning the safe zone into a place where two system errors collided at once. The boss opened its mouth, and its roar struck not the ears but the joints. People fell to their knees, weapons clattering against stone, and Doyun felt fear trying to make him drop the shield and cover his head with his hands. Myung-soo stood between the boss and the wounded, raising his battered shield, though his hands visibly shook. Orange protective light kindled around him, but the roar pressed through his skill the way heavy water presses through a basement door. Doyun looked at Cracked Aegis and saw 10 cracks glowing in different colors. Inside each lived another creature's movement, poison, or strike, and for the first time the shield seemed not like trash, but like a book of pain written across metal. He stepped beside Myung-soo, setting the shield at an angle that would have meant nothing to him that morning. The roar struck the metal, the shield burst into a silver circle, and Doyun felt the boss's fear pass through him like cold animal breath. The reflected roar returned to the boss and struck its bone mask. A crack ran across it. The beast recoiled, and the players around began to rise, grabbing weapons and each other, as though they had been given back not courage, but the ability to move. A new crack appeared in the shield, wide and pale, as though sound itself had passed through the metal. The window named it Roar Break, and Doyun understood that Aegis Zero could return even things that hands could not touch. Ji-hyuk seized the moment and struck the boss from the side, piercing a black plate on his chest. It was a beautiful, precise thrust, and the crowd saw a hero in him again. But Doyun noticed that the Cheonmu heir looked not at the beast's wound, but at the reflecting shield. The boss's bone mask opened like a broken shell, and dark light stretched from within. The system marked the second phase, then strangely slowed the dual notification as though it did not know which rule mattered more inside this chaos. Sora saw on her map the place where two system modes had overlapped badly. Between the duel and the raid appeared a thin administrative fracture, and the lines of Aegis Zero reached toward it as surely as water finds the lowest point. Rin, still hidden among the spectators, flicked a stolen token into the place Sora had been watching. The token stuck in the air, flashed green, and the duel boundary warped for a second, opening a path for Doyun toward the boss. Doyun activated Goblin Rush and let the shield pull his body forward. This time he did not crash into a wall. His feet found the rhythm, his shoulder dropped lower, and the rush became a short, full-weight strike aimed at the crack in the bone mask. The boss met him with a dark beam almost point-blank. The shield split before Doyun could breathe, and the whole world narrowed to black light, silver fragments, and pain in an arm that had become too heavy for its own body. The beam turned back and entered the boss's open mask. The dark light meant for Doyun burned the creature from within, and for a moment, the entire safe zone lit so harshly that the players' faces looked flat, as if painted on glass. The boss collapsed, breaking the arena's edge, and its body began crumbling into black ash. Doyun remained on one knee with the restored shield, and the new crack in the metal was darker than the others, as though it preserved not a strike, but a piece of foreign darkness. Reward windows began appearing one after another, but the duel window remained frozen over them as a red strip. The system seemed to be deciding who had won, who owned the boss, and why an F-rank shield bearer had again ended up at the center of an event that should not have belonged to him. Above Doyun's status, a gray mark appeared for an instant, anomaly candidate. Most players did not see it, but Sora did, and the cyan light in her eyes trembled so sharply that her map pages snapped shut by themselves. Jihek lowered the spear to the floor, and the golden flame sank. Outwardly, he looked calm, but his fingers whitened around the shaft, because the crowd would remember not his thrust, but the cracked shield that had survived both the boss and the duel at the same time. After the boss died, the safe zone restored its blue light and opened the portal outward. Beyond it lay Seoul under the dome, dim and distant, and Doyun felt the thought of Nayeon pierce his exhaustion more sharply than any system notification. He stepped through the portal with cracked Aegis on his arm, no longer the same man who had fallen from a scooter in the rain an hour earlier. Above the black tower, a new window flared, its gray light falling over the city as an order naming Aegis Zero an item to be retrieved. The portal released the survivors onto the plaza before the station, where rain no longer fell but slid along the inner side of the dome in glowing threads. Doyun took a few steps across the wet tiles and only then understood that the city had survived, yet looked like a display case sealed under a lid. Behind temporary barriers stood ordinary citizens, their faces mixing relief with fear of those who had returned from the White Hall. System drones floated above the street, projecting survivors' names onto building walls, and Kang Doyun's gray name flickered beneath the shining ranks of those who carried legendary weapons. Among unfamiliar faces, he searched for Nayeon, though reason told him a 15-year-old schoolgirl would not have been allowed near the tower perimeter. The shield strap dug again at the wound at his wrist, and that pain held Doyun in place when his legs wanted to run toward their apartment district. A group in black coats from the Dawn Assembly approached the plaza, led by a woman with a low bun and a scar beneath her left eye. John Huayan stopped before the survivors, measuring not their weapons, but the way each person carried themselves after the first trial. On the other side of the plaza, Chenmu's white gold tents were already being raised, and strong players were being escorted there, almost like tournament winners. Jihuk stood among cameras and hunters, allowing his armor scratches to be treated, while his gaze kept returning to Doyun's shield. Sora tried to open the city map, but the pages showed only the dome, the tower, and many locked districts. The white mark on her neck faintly flashed when she brought the map closer to Aegis Zero, as if the item and her curse recognized each other through the static of the interface. Ren settled beside a broken vending machine and counted tokens so quickly her fingers seemed to live on their own. She trusted neither the assembly nor Chenmu, but she watched most carefully those who looked at the weaker players as if their future expense sheets. Myung-soo did not head toward the strong players' tents, but helped the injured sit against the station wall. His firefighter jacket was torn in several places, its orange protective glow already gone, yet people reached for him more calmly than for any system healer nearby. Survivor registration unfolded above the plaza, and colored frames began sorting people faster than they could say their names. S-rank and A-rank players were directed into a separate corridor. Mid-ranks received waiting tokens, while Doyun's gray frame lingered longer than all the others. His attributes looked almost humiliating. Low strength, low endurance, weak mana, unstable class. Only the item line showed D-rank cracked Aegis, and beneath it the gray shadow of a mark sometimes surfaced, only for the interface to try covering it again. Shenmue representatives came for the shield not like a trophy, but like property filed under the wrong owner. The assembly's barrier rose between them and Doyun as a transparent wall, and Hua-yan looked at him with the interest of someone who saw a political problem before the crowd did. On the massive screen above the plaza, Jihyok's claim against the ARC results appeared. In system language, it sounded like a dispute over reward accuracy, but the players' faces understood something else. The Shenmue heir wanted public proof that the cracked shield did not deserve its owner. Doyun felt the plaza become an arena again, though ordinary city tiles lay beneath his feet. Shouts, cameras, and system frames pressed together into one heavy noise, while somewhere far beneath the dome, his phone still lay in a puddle with Nayeon's photo on the screen. Hua-yan did not let the dispute spread across the plaza and directed the survivors toward the registration center, where tests could become a legal shield against the guilds. Doyun followed her, feeling that the city walls around him were no softer than the stone corridors of the Ark. The Hunter Registration Center stood several blocks from the station, guarded by thick glass and rows of mobile turrets. Inside, the air smelled of ozone, medicine, and wet clothing, while testing artifacts glowed on pedestals with almost the same arrogance as the weapons in the White Hall. The first test measured strength, and it ended so quickly that several observers barely had time to raise their tablets. The stone plate beneath Doyun's palm barely trembled, and a number surfaced above it, far too ordinary for someone who had just survived the boss. During the speed test, he ran the light path with a stubborn face and heavy breathing. The result landed below that of an average rookie hunter, and the whispers behind the glass grew more confident, as though people had finally received a simple explanation. The shield was strange, but the boy himself remained weak. The mana inside him answered with a faint gray shimmer that quickly scattered into the air. Sora watched the readings more closely than the others, and noticed that the shield did not glow at all in that moment, as if refusing to help where no blow had yet been dealt. Behind the glass, Jihyok looked perfectly calm again. Every weak reading returned a piece of his stolen stage, and the people beside him were already preparing the conclusion of a random item that needed to be handed to a worthy guild. Hua-yan waited until the mockery became obvious enough, then ordered the item reaction test to begin. Before Doyun rose a long device with a crystal barrel, designed to fire a magic projectile normally used to examine B-rank guardians and above. Doyun raised the shield before his chest, but now his elbow did not hang in panic. It held the angle he learned inside the Ark. The crystal gathered blue light, and each crack across Aegis Zero seemed to wake one after another, listening for the approaching strike. The projectile struck the sensor of the shield and broke it in a burst of blue and silver light. Doyun felt pressure in his ribs, as though the magic had passed for a second through the air inside his lungs, and then cracked Aegis returned the force to where it had come from. The crystal device burst from within, and the room's protective glass filled with a web of cracks. Several analysts fell from their chairs, while an alarm flared above the destroyed artifact, marking S-rank equipment damaged by an item they had called a rookie mistake minutes earlier. A new blue crack appeared across the shield, straight and bright like a lightning line beneath glass. The window named it Mana Bolt Reverse, and Doyun noticed that the pain after reflection came more softly this time, yet stayed deeper, somewhere behind his breastbone. The center's main screen suddenly went dark, then displayed a line none of the technicians had entered. Unauthorized reflection protocol blinked in black letters over a white background, and the room became so abruptly quiet that water dripping from the survivor's clothes could be heard. Haiyan was the first to order the test record saved, but Qianmu representatives almost simultaneously tried to seal the log. Sora managed to catch part of the data on her pages, and the white mark on her neck flared harder, leaving a thin line of pain beneath the skin. Doyun noticed Sora pressing her fingers to her collar as if adjusting the fabric, though the fabric had not moved. The shield in his hand answered with a faint white gleam, and for an instant an almost invisible thread stretched between her mark and Aegis Zero's cracks. Ji-hyuk left the observation room before the discussion ended, and Chenmu's people followed. His departure looked like a noble refusal to continue the scandal, but in the glass reflection, Doyun saw the guild air white blood from his scratch with too much force. Haiyan issued Doyun a temporary license under assembly protection, but the card's gray color spoke of supervision more clearly than any warning. He was no longer merely a free survivor. He had become a disputed asset, one the different powers could touch only more carefully. By night, they were escorted through a side exit to avoid cameras and Qianmu supporters. The street beneath the dome smelled of overheated metal, and Sora showed Doyun the stolen log fragment, where beside Aegis Zero appeared a word that did not exist in modern item databases. The black market had opened inside an old shopping underpass that once sold phones and cheap umbrellas. Now system seals hung there. The air smelled of monster blood and fried canned food, and Doyun walked between stalls with cracked Aegis hidden beneath the dark cloak of Myung-soo. Ren led them confidently through the noisy passage, where every second trader tried to buy information, and every third had already sold someone else's. She did not look back, but her fingers kept touching the tokens at her belt, checking that they had not become another person's loot. Deep inside the market, Sora found a terminal hidden behind a wall of rusted machines. Its screen was cracked, yet old item databases still breathed inside it, and her map pages settled over the surface, drawing data on the word Aegis from the archival dark. Fragments of lines appeared on the screen, half erased or replaced by white noise. The words prototype and null quartz flashed beside Aegis Zero, while below them hung an old note reading "Recovery failed," as if someone had already tried to retrieve the shield and had not survived the attempt. Doyun lifted the edge of the cloak and looked at the cracks, which no longer seemed accidental. Each line lay across the metal with too much intention, and he felt uneasy at the thought that the item left until last might not have been waiting for just any owner. Sora tried to open a deeper record, but the white mark on her neck flared, and the terminal distorted her reflection. For a moment, her face became unfamiliar, outlined by a thin frame like an item the system intended to inspect for usefulness someday. Doyun touched her shoulder before deciding whether he had the right to interfere. The map pages snapped shut, the white symbols beneath her skin faded, and Sora breathed through clenched teeth for several seconds, keeping herself from collapsing among the market stalls. Myung-soo positioned himself so his broad back hid Sora from the market. Rin lazily spun a knife before an overly curious trader, and the man immediately discovered more important business, leaving the group with the broken terminal and an uneasy silence around the shield. When Sora's breathing steadied, she showed a thin link on the page between her curse and Aegis Zero. It was not proof, more the trace of the same hand that had once marked her neck and hidden the reflection line inside the shield. The market screen suddenly changed from advertisements buying claws to an emergency report. Civilians were trapped in the sunken metro dungeon, infected by poisonous water, while the medicinal drop lay in the station's heart, where the guilds did not yet want to send expensive teams. Myung-soo froze before the screen, and the old burn scar on his neck darkened under the yellow light. To others, it was a risky job with poor payment, but for a man used to entering places others fled, the report had already become a rout. Doyun wanted to say they needed to find Nayeon, but the screen showed a girl about her age lying under a thin blanket in an evacuation tunnel. The words stuck in his throat, and the shield on his arm grew heavier, as if it had seen that face too. Hwa Yun's projection appeared above the market terminal with the Dawn Assembly seal. She did not ask for heroism, she offered official clearance, access to a sealed entrance, and protection from Chen Mu if Doyun helped bring the medicine out of the metro. Half an hour later, they stood before the sealed entrance to an old metro line where black algae had grown over the turnstiles. The air from the tunnel was wet and sour, and cracked aegis rang softly on Doyun's arm, as if recognizing the scent of a future blow. The system seal opened with a low groan, and the dungeon name appeared across the wall, Sunken Metro. Doyun followed Myung-soo down the stairs, leaving behind the market, the dome, and the city that still held his sister somewhere beyond block streets. The station below was flooded to the ankles, and old trains stood in the tunnels wrapped in black algae. Advertisement panels flickered underwater, showing fragments of the old life, coffee, concerts, apartments in new districts, which now looked like images from another world. Sora opened her map, and cyan lines settled across the water like a fine net. The white stains inside the station did not stay still. They moved slowly, as if the dungeon's architecture were breathing and rearranging corridors while humans tried choosing a path. Rin lowered a knife into the water and immediately pulled it back when a long shadow flickered beneath the surface. Green slime clung to the blade, and the metal began to hiss softly, making even Myung-soo place his feet more carefully. Doyun held the shield lower than usual, nearly touching the water with its edge. The green venom reversal crack glowed more faintly than the others, but familiar bitterness lived inside it, and he understood this floor would teach him not only to take blows, but to endure what they left behind. The first swarm burst from beneath the platform, tearing the water with dozens of small splashes. Doyun managed to cover a civilian against the wall, and the bite struck the metal so quickly that cracked aegis broke and restored itself almost in a single breath. The reflected bite sent the creatures back into the water as torn bundles, but each small attack left the faintest scratch of light on the shield. Doyun did not receive a new echo, yet he felt the item gathering experience not only from strong blows, but from the stubborn cruelty of weak creatures. Myung-soo forced open a train door with its firefighter axe and pulled out an infected man whose neck was veined with black lines. The civilian was alive, but the water had already marked his body, and the medicine in the station's heart stopped being an abstract reward. Sora found the service tunnel leading toward the central station around the main hall. The map warned of toxic water pressure, and the green symbols on it flashed in the same shade as the venom reversal crack across Doyun's shield. When they entered the tunnel, poisonous vapor rose from grates along the walls. Doyun raised a shield before the group, but the vapor did not strike as a single blow, and Aegis Zero trembled, unable to find a clear cause it could return. Myung-soo changed the old ventilation flow with a strike of his axe, and Rin jammed a stolen system plate into the grate, forcing the vapor into a narrow stream. Only then did the shield catch the poison as a directed effect, and the green crack flared with full light. The reflected poison rushed back into the pipes, and monsters hiding in the ventilation system shrieked behind the walls. Doyun coughed, tasting bitterness on his tongue, while Sora marked a new rule on the map. The shield needed direction, even when the environment itself became the enemy. After the reflection, a heavy wave passed through the shield, and the 25th crack connected some older lines into a small mirrored cell. Cracked Aegis changed this name to C-Rank Mirror Archive, and 3 echoes lit above it like saved pages from battles. Doyun itself had barely changed, but the shield had become different. The cracks no longer lay randomly, instead gathering into angular cells, as though an archive had formed inside the metal. The silver gleam in his eyes remained longer, and for the first time, it made him look away from his own reflection. The mirror archive window showed 3 available echo slots, and Sora quickly helped choose the ones that could save the group inside the metro. Doyun fixed Goblin Rush, Venom Reversal, and Roar Break into place, feeling each stored skill settle onto the shield as a separate weight. The service tunnel led them to the central station, where the water had risen to their knees and moved in rhythm with another creature's breathing. At the far end of the platform, a huge many-headed body lifted itself up, and the system finally displayed the boss's name, Nalkar, Mother Hydra. Nalkar filled almost the entire station, her head sliding between columns while poison fell from her fangs in thick threads. Each splash hissed against the concrete steps, and Doyun realized the earlier serpents had only been this monster's tongues, testing the taste of future prey. White gold Qianmu emblems flared across the upper gallery. Their squad had reached the station by another route and was already closing a gate, cutting civilians off from the exit so Nalkar would remain anchored to the station and produce a rare drop after being killed. Myung-soo struck the gate so hard sparks rained into the poisonous water. His face darkened with anger, but the iron held under a system seal, and the Tianmu fighters above did not even look down at the people beginning to understand they had become bait. Sora tried to find a weak point in the gate, but the map gave an unpleasant answer. The seal would open only after Nalkar's core was damaged. The path to medicine, escape, and the civilians' freedom ran through a creature the system had marked as an authorized disaster. Doyun stepped into the middle of the flooded platform and raised Mirror Archive. 3 echo cells opened above the shield, yet none promised victory over a boss of such size. They merely reminded him he had several ways not to die immediately. Nalkar's first head spat a stream of poison, and Doyun turned the shield so it would not return into the crowd. The metal shattered in a green flash, and the reflection veered toward an empty part of the platform, burning concrete instead of infected bodies. The water around his knee hissed as a new poisonous line joined the older crack. Pain from venom reversal climbed into his throat as burning bitterness, and Sora saw Mirror Archive lose stability for a moment under the pressure of an effect too wide to hold cleanly. Rin sprang onto the railings and ran above the water, throwing knives into Nalkar's smaller heads. She could not deal serious damage, but every movement forced part of the monster to turn away from the civilians, and that was enough to buy seconds. Myung-soo moved the infected toward the stairs, covering them from poison spray with his own body. Orange protective light returned around his shoulders, but it grew thinner with each step, as if the old firefighter's skill burned the same oxygen as his breath. Nalkar raised all her heads at once, and the water around the station began to glow from below. Sora saw an expanding green circle on her map and understood the monster's next breath would not hit a target, but the entire safe area, turning people into part of the swamp. Doyun opened the roar break cell and struck the water with the shield, releasing the stored roar from the Arc Boss in reverse. The sound did not move toward the people, but into Nalkar's open mouths, disrupting her breathing rhythm and forcing the poison to spill too early. The poison explosion still covered the station, but Mirror Archive opened the brief mirrored field around Doyun for the first time. It was uneven, shaking, only a few steps wide, yet the nearest civilians saw green drops hang in the air and bounce backward. On the upper gallery, Chanmu fighters stopped watching Nalkar. Their attention shifted to mirrored field, and several crossbows rose toward Doyun, because the valuable shield was becoming more dangerous than the boss if its owner could protect someone else's bait. Sora saw the red aiming lines before the bolts flew. Her map unfolded before her, the curse mark flaring painfully, yet she still sent cyan lines toward Doyun, warning him through the trembling reflection across the shield. Bolts from above and poison from below arrived almost together, turning protection into the kind of choice the system loved most. Doyun turned the shield between the two directions, and Mirror Archive cracked so loudly it sounded as if every blow it had survived were arguing inside the metal. Myung-soo understood that Doyun would not cover everyone in time, and stepped out from the group toward the poison wave. His old shield rose before his chest, the orange protective light flared brighter than before, and his firefighter jacket opened in the rush of heated air. Doyun chose the bolts because they were already flying toward the civilians' backs. The shield shattered under the rain of projectiles, the reflection shot upward, and Chanmu's gallery erupted in screams as their own attack returned into the white gold emblems. Nalkar's poison struck Myung-soo, and his protective shield cracked from rim to center. The orange light held for several agonizing seconds, long enough for the civilians to retreat, and then the wave swallowed the firefighter up to his shoulders. Doyun turned too late. The water around Myung-soo turned black, and even Rin, always ready to move, froze on the railing with a knife in her hand, because some losses happened faster than the body could search for an escape. Myung-soo did not fall. He stood in the water, holding the passage with his body while black veins climbed his neck toward the burn scar, and Doyun saw that a true shield could be made not from metal, but from the decision not to step back. Doyun rushed toward him, opening Goblin Rush and Venom Reversal together through Mirror Archive. The shield dragged his body forward, the green crack flaring with dangerous brightness, but Sora could already see the poison had entered Myung-soo too deeply for an ordinary reflection. Nalkar's central head opened wider than the others, revealing a dark green core inside its mouth. It was the point from which all the station's poison originated, and Doyun understood that reflecting separate streams no longer had meaning. Myung-soo caught the edge of Doyun's shield with a hand already darkened by poison and turned it towards the central mouth. The gesture was weak but precise, like in the Arc Corridor when he had first shown that protection began with an angle. Nalkar's second breath struck the shield with the weight of the entire station. Mirror Archive broke in a huge green flash, and Doyun felt the poison not merely touch his body, but try to write its swamp into him. The reflection returned into the central mouth, where the dark green core cracked under its own force. Nalkar's heads thrashed against the columns, water rose like a wall, and the gate above the civilians screeched as its system seal began to fail. The shield restored itself, but part of the green light did not remain in the metal. Beneath the bandage on Doyun's left arm, silver-green lines surfaced, and the cold prickling in his skin told him some reflections would now leave marks deeper than the item. Myung-soo finally collapsed near the stairs, where the civilians were already escaping past the gate. Doyun caught him under the shoulders, but the orange protective light crumbled between his fingers, like embers held in the palms for too long. Myung-soo's face became calm only after the last infected person passed behind him. Doyun held him in the water, unable to hear the victory cries around them, and every crack on Mirror Archive seemed far too loud in that moment. Nalkar dissolved into rotting ash, leaving a medicinal crystal in the water with a soft green glow. Sora lifted it with trembling hands, yet her gaze remained on Doyun, who still had not released the man who had taught him how to hold a shield. Victory did not have time to become salvation. The station water suddenly froze, Nalkar's ash stopped in the air, and above the platform appeared a tall white figure with a square halo, looking at Doyun as if he had come not for a person, but for a malfunctioning machine. The white figure identified itself as Inspector L7, but the name Nox flashed in the interface before the system managed to hide the number. His silver eyes were smooth circles, and chains of system symbols floated around his wrists, too even for magic and too cold for metal. Doyun slowly stood after leaving Myung-soo on a dry step, where Sora had already placed a cloak. His left arm burned beneath the bandage, Mirror Archive weighed heavier than before, and Nox's gaze passed through the shield as if searching for a serial number inside it. An accusation window unfolded before Doyun, naming his actions a violation of reflection protocol and illegal interference in an authorized disaster. The words on the screen were dry, yet the water at his feet began covering itself with a thin layer of ice. Sora understood the meaning of the wording before the others. Nalkar had not been a random boss, but a tool meant to reduce weaker players. Rin raised her knives, though her body already knew striking such an enemy would be like cutting her own reflection in glass. Nox extended his hand, and chains made of symbols slid toward Mirror Archive. They made no sound and left no marks in the water, but Doyun felt each chain press against his status, trying not to break his body, but to close his right to move. A skill lock window opened above him, and the shield's echo cells began turning gray one by one. Goblin Rush faded, Venom Reversal tightened into a green dot, and Roar Break trembled as if sound had been locked inside a room with padded walls. Doyun tried to raise the shield, but his arm stopped halfway. It was not muscle weakness. The system's command lay over him like an invisible slab, and even the pain in his wrist became distant, as though it belonged to another body. Sora opened her map, despite the mark flaring at her neck. Cyan lines struck the white chains, not breaking them, but showing Doyun the direction of their pressure, and in the shield's reflection, the system command, for the first time, looked like an attack with a source. He could not swing his arm, but he managed to turn his wrist by a few degrees. That was enough. The chains entered the cracks of Mirror Archive, and the shield did not defend against the command, but accepted it as a blow that had lacked shape until now. Mirror Archive shattered into white fragments, and Skill Lock turned back along the chains. Nox moved from his position for the first time, his square halo trembling, while several symbols around his wrists went dark, as if the system had been struck across its own fingers. The shield restored with a new white crack, and several more silver lines appeared beneath the skin of Doyun's left arm. He dropped to one knee, feeling the reflected command leave not a wound, but a cold place in his body, where the system had tried to halt his will. Nox no longer looked at Doyun like a low-level malfunction. Damaged windows trembled around the inspector, and within their distorted lines, Sora managed to see a phrase that immediately explained the administrator's fear. Aegis Zero was not meant for players. The phrase struck Sora's mark harder than any curse before it. She fell to her knees, the map pages scattering around her in glowing shreds, and white symbols began climbing from her neck toward her jaw, like another person's hands searching for her mouth. Doyun crawled toward her through the icy water and placed the shield between Sora and Nox. Though his arm shook so badly, the strap cut into his skin again. In the metal's reflection, he saw not the inspector's face, but the white command biting into Sora's neck. Nox raised his hand, and the station around them turned into smooth glass reflecting water, ash, and Myungsu's body in one motionless layer. The dungeon did not vanish at once. It seemed folded into a mirror where the next interrogation was already waiting, without walls or exits. The mirror hall had no ceiling, yet reflections climbed upward so far the eyes tired before finding an end. Doyun woke on the cold floor. Sora lay nearby. Rin was already on her feet, and Myungsu's body had vanished, leaving only a warm orange gleam across the shield. When he stood, he saw the bandage on his left arm no longer fully hid the cracks. Silver-green lines shone through the cloth, and Mirror Archive answered them with a muted ring, as though part of the item had remained beneath its owner's skin. In a distant reflection, a golden portal opened, and Jihyuk entered the hall, with several Qianmu shadows behind him. His armor had been restored, his spear shone cleaner than before, but his gaze found the weakened Doyun at once, as if the road here had been a continuation of an unfinished duel. Ren stepped toward Sora and spread her knives, though her whole weight was ready to slip aside at the spear's first thrust. In the mirrors behind her, small green-eyed figures multiplied, making her presence, for the first time, larger than her body seemed. Jihyuk raised Sunpiercer, and its golden light stretched across the mirrors and long lines. Nox did not interfere. The inspector watched closely, as if human resentment were a convenient tool that could test the shield without requiring an official command. The spear struck through the reflections, and the mirrors twisted its path until the golden tip appeared in several places at once. Doyun raised the shield by instinct, but Mirror Archive found the real vector through the pressure of the air, not through the light lying inside the mirrors. The reflection worked only partly, and the blow threw Doyun across the smooth floor. The silver lines on his arm widened toward the elbow, and for a second a cold system tone rang inside his head, as if his body had begun accepting the shield's language. Sora lifted herself on one elbow and spread the torn map beneath Jihyuk. The cyan lines did not attack him, but highlighted the true reflections, and Doyun saw where the man stood who had spent his whole life occupying the center of the stage. Doyun opened the stored Mana Bolt Reverse Echo and caught the remaining golden force inside a shield cell. Instead of a direct counterattack, he drove the power into the floor, where the mirrors cracked beneath Jihyuk and briefly stole his perfect footing. Jihyuk fell to one knee, and his heavy breathing became audible in the hall. Nox finally moved, extending a white candidate seal toward him, while the mirrors around them showed Jihyuk not as a hero, but as a man being offered appointment in place of worth. The seal touched Jihyuk's armor, and the line flared above his status, System Vessel Candidate. The golden light of Sunpiercer mixed with Nox's white glow, making the Qianmu air brighter, yet his own shadow in the mirror became thinner. Mirror Archive trembled in Doyun's hand, gathering traces of bolts, poison, command, and golden spear into one pattern. The cracks multiplied faster than he could count, and Sora saw the number of fractures approaching a threshold that had never been listed in any database. The 50th crack connected the shield's center to its rim, and the metal opened into several floating plates. Mirror Bastion became A-rank Mirror Bastion. A mirrored field several steps wide formed around Doyun, while the cracks on his left arm glowed through the bandage in steady silver. The mirror hall darkened, and in every reflection behind Nox appeared a white throne. Upon it sat a tall figure with golden eyes, and even Nox lowered his head when Rael named Doyun an error of the old court that should have been retrieved before the fortress awakened. The hall opened back into a view of Seoul beneath the dome, where a new system window flared above the city, placing a bounty on Kang Doyun's head. Mirror Bastion reflected the gray light of the Order across allies and enemies alike, and Doyun understood that now more than a guild would be hunting him. The mirror hall opened into an ashen city where dried lava channels replaced streets, and buildings stood with broken windows like empty eye sockets. Doyun stepped through first, and the plates of Mirror Bastion immediately folded around him, reflecting the gray light of the bounty placed over his head only moments before. Sora followed him while holding her collar, where the white mark smoldered beneath the skin again. Rin was already watching rooftops and balconies because the bounty on Doyun had turned every broken facade into a possible hiding place for someone willing to hunt him. Huayan's projection flickered over the remains of a street sign, her face breaking into violet bands. The assembly managed to transmit only part of the data. The 51st floor was a betrayal trial, and every player inside would receive personal tasks tied to the price of someone else's life. Hundreds of red windows opened above the city, and people in neighboring streets began stopping one by one. Doyun saw their gazes change before they raised weapons. The system did not create resentment, it merely pointed carefully at who would be rewarded for turning it into action. Mirror Bastion reflected part of the red light, and the windows warped around the group for a moment, as if unable to choose their target properly. Beneath the bandage, Doyun's left arm pulsed. The silver cracks reminded him of the skill lock he had returned to Nox through his own body. The first players emerged from side alleys almost peacefully, holding weapons low and pretending to search for a path. Sora opened her map and saw their routes converging toward Doyun as red lines, drawn not by fear, but by the reward the system had promised them. Rin smashed a smoke capsule against the ground, one she had stolen from the market, and gray fog blended with the city ash. The group moved between overturned buses, while Doyun held the shield not in front of himself, but to the side, covering Sora from the upper floor lines of fire. The first arrow came from the roof of an old shopping center and struck a mirrored plate almost without sound. Doyun turned the shield, sending the reflection into a wall, because the archer was a frightened teenager with a shaking hand, not an enemy he wanted to kill. The system immediately increased the reward above the teenager, and red light settled over his eyes like an illness. Sora clenched the pages of her map, understanding the trial was not testing betrayal, it was cultivating it, feeding every weakness with a precise amount. When another player tried to kill the archer for points, Doyun sent a mirrored plate not toward himself, but to the roof. The blow bounced into an empty air conditioning unit, and the teenager fell to his knees, seeing for the first time that the bounty target could protect someone who had already fired. Mirror Bastion expanded several meters, and the plates around Doyun moved like the shields of an unseen squad. He took attacks from 2 streets at once, turning reflections into asphalt and walls, while every act of mercy left a new silver thread across his arm. A new parameter appeared on Sora's map, one she had not searched for. Beside Mirror Bastion flickered a forecast of emotional response loss, and she hid the page too late. Doyun saw the cold gauge where every person saved pushed him closer to becoming a tool.
At a ruined fountain, he stopped for a second and saw his own eyes in the murky water, too silver for the tired face of a courier. The thought of Myungsu rose with the smell of ash, and Doyun tightened the shield strap harder, choosing pain as a way to remain inside himself. Beyond the next block opened White Square, the central zone of the floor, where system gates hung between 2 burned towers. The map showed the path forward only through it, while red lines from players flowed there as well, turning the square into the throat of a trap. Above the square, Rael's symbol flared, a golden eye within a white circle, and all the red trial windows vanished at once. For one brief moment, silence settled, and Doyun understood the administrator had decided not to wait for humans to break him on his behalf. White Square stretched, changing size beneath their feet, and became streets of mirrored storefronts, where everyone saw a richer version of themselves. Betrayal contracts appeared in the hands of players around them, while promised rewards shimmered beside their reflections in the glass. Sora found a thin route on the map through back corridors behind the storefronts, where the surveillance system left blind spots. Doyun led there those who had not yet raised weapons, gathering around him people the trial had already marked as weak points in someone else's conscience. Rin moved ahead, opening service doors with a knife and guiding children towards safer corners with gestures. Red contract windows reflected across the floor, and every step upon them sounded as though the group were walking across betrayals someone else had not yet carried out. Mirror Bastion opened into a dome above the group, protecting not only Sora and Rin, but dozens of strangers. Doyun felt every hit against the mirrored plates like an impact against his own ribs, though no new wounds appeared across his body. A separate contract suddenly opened before Sora, and the white mark on her neck answered with bright light. The system offered to remove her curse in exchange for the core coordinates of Mirror Bastion, and the girl froze for a moment, because her pain had finally been given an exact price. Sora's fingers closed around the red window, and the map pages cut the contract into thin strips of light. The mark immediately sank deeper, but she did not hide the pain from Doyun. Instead, she raised her head and showed him a new route, trembling with interference. Doyun saw the red light die in her hand, and the silver in his eyes receded for a moment, letting a warm brown shade through. Mirror Bastion no longer pressed so coldly on his shoulders, because beside him stood someone who could choose pain as firmly as any shield. Players who had signed the contracts struck the dome together, hoping many weaker attacks would overload the reflection. Doyun did not send the blows back into people, he redirected them into the storefronts, and the glass versions of promised wealth shattered, robbing the trial of its sweetest image. On Sora's map, the crack count passed 70, and the mirrored field stopped shaking with every strike. Stability came together with a frightening quiet inside Doyun, as if the shield had learned to protect many people by taking from its owner the right to respond to each one separately. He walked ahead with almost mechanical steadiness, and Mirror Bastion's plates moved around him with independent precision. Rin looked back several times because Doyun had stopped flinching at shots, screams, and the blood of strangers on the floor, and that frightened her more than the hunt itself. Sora touched the nearest plate and saw Doyun reflected with fully silver eyes, standing among people like an unmoving wall. She said nothing aloud, but pressed her fingers against the cold surface until a small distortion from the warmth of her palm appeared in the reflection. When the last rescued person passed toward the exit, Nox's white seal flared across the gate. The city of betrayal began folding back into White Square, while system chains descended above it, turning the completed trial into a new judicial protocol. Nox stood at the center of the square, and his square halo now carried a thin crack. The damage did not make him weak, but it broke an administrator's perfection for the first time, and Doyun understood the reflected skill lock had marked more than his own arm. Walls of white light rose around the square, cutting off exits and assembly projections. Huaiyan vanished from the connection. Players froze at the barrier's edge, and the system changed the zone status from safe to judicial arena, where the prohibition against killing no longer applied. Above Doyun opened the suppression of anomaly protocol, and Mirror Bastion answered with a sharp metallic ring. Sora saw in the structure not a spell, but a legal cage built from tower rules, every clause aimed at a single point, the shield. Chains of light fell over Mirror Bastion and began pulling its plates back toward the core. Unlike Skill Lock, this protocol did not close skills. It tried returning the item to its state before selection, erasing the cracks as records obtained illegally. Several smaller cracks went dark, and Doyun felt it like pieces of memory being torn out. Goblin strikes, metro water, the roar of the first boss became paler inside the shield for a moment, and with them faded the people those reflections had helped save. Sora did not try to break the chains with force. She threw map pages between the protocol lines, turning cyan markings into wedges that did not destroy the cage, but spread its bars wide enough for Doyun to find the direction of the blow again. Rin ran along the edge of the square, striking the white anchors of the protocol where Sora had marked them. Each knife hit produced only a spark, yet those sparks were enough to make the chains over Mirror Bastion tremble out of rhythm. Doyun turned Mirror Bastion not outward, but into the chains, accepting the protocol as pressure from every side. It felt like trying to breathe underwater, yet inside the tightening light, he found the source, a smooth white line connected to Nox's cracked halo. The shield broke through all its plates at once, filling the square with silver-white fragments. The reflected protocol returned to Nox through his own halo, and the white chains wrapped around the inspector for a moment with the same cold precision he had used on others. Nox's face cracked with thin lines like porcelain, but he did not cry out or retreat. Instead, the inspector opened an emergency channel, and above the square appeared a direct report to Rael, naming the failure a law-level threat. Rael's golden light descended over the square, and Nox lowered his head so deeply his cracked halo touched his chest. There was no repentance in the gesture. He resembled a tool admitting before its owner that it had become insufficiently sharp. Rael did not interrogate the inspector. Golden windows opened around Nox, and his own chains began erasing their master's body, turning the white figure into falling symbols. Doyun watched an administrator delete a subordinate as calmly as the system closing an unnecessary window. Before vanishing, Nox left behind a small white fragment that flew not to Rael, but to Sora. She caught it with a map page, and horror flashed in her eyes. Inside the fragment lay a description of Mirror Fortress and a warning about the 100th crack. Mirror Bastion restored, but the white cracks from the protocol had deepened and tied older lines into a new pattern. Doyun stared at the place where Nox had vanished, understanding that an enemy capable of stopping his skills had himself been expendable in someone else's court. Sora unfolded Nox's fragment over the map,
and a diagram of 100 cracks appeared above the shield. 90 empty cells were crossed by old cipher marks, while above the current form shimmered an intermediate name, Law Mirror, tied to the reflection of rules. After Nox's death, White Square began collapsing not downward but upward, breaking into pieces of light that rose into the dark sky. Beneath their feet opened a staircase of transparent steps, leading toward the next floor where clocks without hands hung above the clouds. Huayan's projection returned for several seconds, shaking under heavy interference. She transmitted that Jiyak and Chenmu had received official passage to the upper floors as system allies, while Nayen had been moved to a guarded sector of Seoul, where cameras showed only corridors. Nayen's name struck harder than any chain Nox had used, but Doyun did not run back because the road below was already closing under Rael's light. He climbed the first step, and Mirror Bastion followed in floating plates, looking more and more like the walls of a future fortress. The heavenly arena hung above the clouds, and clocks without hands turned slowly around it. Between them glided Asterion, the Chrono Dragon, whose scales reflected not light, but brief fragments of future movements, as if each plate already remembered the next strike. The system named Asterion a Law Beast, and the air around the group cracked in thin rings. Doyun raised Mirror Bastion, but the shield did not immediately find the attack's direction, because the dragon had not struck the body. It had compressed the very moment in which the body intended to move. The first loop began with a tail strike that Rin saw only after she had fallen. Then the arena blinked, and she stood in the same place again, but the bruise on her shoulder remained, proving time had returned only the scene, not the pain. Sora began marking repeating lines on her map, while the loop returned them to the battle's beginning. The white mark at her neck bled light, but each note remained on the page, allowing the group to remember more than the dragon permitted. Doyun tried to meet the time wave with the shield, but Mirror Bastion lagged by a fraction of a second. His body existed in two positions at once, one falling and one still holding stance, and the split brought nausea into his chest like memory turned inside out. Asterion opened his mouth, and transparent chains stretched from it to the clocks around the arena. Sora saw that the dragon did not create time. He drew it from the suspended dials like water from reservoirs, directing the flow into the players. Doyun stopped watching the dragon and turned the plates toward the clocks. Mirror Bastion caught a transparent chain, and the shield trembled for the first time, not from the strength of an impact, but from the order of events trying to pass through it and rewrite the next moment. The shield broke into fragments, holding different seconds of the battle. A drop of Rin's blood hung beside Doyun's face. Ash from Youngsu's cloak froze near his shoulder, and between these small stillnesses, he found a direction of the time flow. The reflection went not into Asterion, but into the nearest dial, and the clock glass cracked under its own loop. The arena blinked, but this time the group did not return to the start. The dragon lost one reservoir of time, and his wings fell out of rhythm. A transparent crack appeared on Mirror Bastion, visible only through the distortion of the air. The system named it Time Reversal Echo, then immediately warned of instability, because even the shield could not store time as calmly as poison or impact. Asterion roared, and several clocks around the arena cracked under his own rage. The dragon no longer held the battle inside a clean loop. He tore seconds into pieces, throwing them at Doyun like sharp plates of future, where every version ended with him falling. Doyun opened the field before Sora and Rin, taking future strikes one after another. His face became nearly motionless, and Sora saw the humanity forecast drop again on the map, while Mirror Bastion learned to answer time in the language of law. When the crack count passed 80, Mirror Bastion's plates lengthened and thinned, as though unnecessary weight had been drawn from the metal. The system reluctantly changed the name to S-Rank Law Mirror, and around Doyun formed a dome where seconds moved more carefully. Law Mirror caught the final loop and returned it into Asterion, without destroying the dragon from outside. The creature froze inside its own cycle, opening its mouth again and again for a strike already returning into it, until its scales dissolved into transparent dust. When the dust of time settled, a staircase toward the administrator layer opened beyond the arena. On the first step stood Ji-hyuk, surrounded by the golden light of Sunpiercer and the white halo of a candidate, while his shadow on the transparent floor had become barely visible. The staircase between them was narrow, and every step was covered with reflections of past battles. Ji-hyuk descended several steps, looking more like a hero statue than a living man, yet the golden spear in his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Above Ji-hyuk shimmered the status system vessel candidate, more than 80% complete. White lines crossed his armor over the gold, and Doyun saw that the system had not strengthened the Chenmu air so much as carefully occupied the places where doubt used to be. The spear struck downward, and the steps beneath Doyun cracked in the shape of a sunbeam. Law Mirror met the attack with several plates, but Ji-hyuk's white halo altered the strike's rule, forcing part of its force not to pass through space, but through the shield owner's status. Doyun was thrown back across the steps, and a thin black crack appeared beneath his clothes over his chest. It did not bleed, but cold rose from it toward his throat, as though the strike had touched not his body, but the record proving he had the right to stand. Sora tried to approach, but the white lines of Ji-hyuk's status repelled her map with a sharp blow. Ren caught her by the shoulder, keeping her from falling, and for a second both saw Law Mirror around Doyun grow thinner, protecting only the most necessary outline. Doyun rose slowly, and the silver in his eyes had almost completely driven out the brown. Sora saw a new risk on the map. Law Mirror was offering to suppress personal attachments in order to calculate the reflection of a system vessel more efficiently. Doyun reflected the next blow aside, sending white gold force into the void and shattering part of the staircase. Along with the stone fell reflections of Ji-hyuk's old choices: training, family praise, his father's face that had always looked only at results. Ji-hyuk stopped for a moment, seeing his reflections not as greatness, but as a long corridor of other people's expectations. The white halo above him flared, trying to smother the pause, and the spear pulled him forward again before his face could admit exhaustion. Law Mirror displayed before Doyun the fastest path to victory. Accept the full strike of Sunpiercer and return it into the vessel's core. The calculation was clean, almost beautiful, but at the end of the line stood Ji-hyuk's body, pierced by his own spear. Sora placed both palms against the edge of the field, and the warmth of her hands distorted the calculation. In the reflection beside Doyun appeared Nayeon and Myeongsu, not as system visions, but as memories of people for whom the shield must not become an execution machine. When Ji-hyuk struck, Doyun changed the angle on his final breath. The reflection did not enter the body, but struck the white candidate's halo, sending a crack through it and forcing the spear's gold light to separate from the foreign administrator glow. Ji-hyuk fell onto the step, and the white lines on his armor began tearing like threads pulled from skin. Sunpiercer dimmed, and for the first time, the weapon looked not legendary, but heavy, an object that had forced its owner to stand upright for too long. On Sora's map, the crack count stopped at 99. Doyun stood over Ji-hyuk with an almost empty face, and Law Mirror again offered to complete the threat, because an unfinished vessel remained a potential channel for Rail. Ji-hyuk himself lifted Sunpiercer and struck it against the step, breaking the spearhead. Golden fragments flew upward and entered the gate seal, while the remaining white halo above his head crumbled, taking with it the final percentage of bezel completion. Sora stepped toward Doyun and embraced him through the trembling field of Law Mirror, not breaking the protection, but warming it from within. The silver in his eyes wavered, a ring of brown returned, and the 99 cracks stopped sounding like a sentence. Ji-hyuk's broken spear opened the gates of the White Court, and beyond them appeared a hall whose walls were made of endless system windows. Rail sat far ahead upon a white throne, while behind him shimmered images of worlds that had already passed through the same selection. Doyun entered first, but now Sora and Rin were not the only ones behind him. Jihook rose with difficulty and followed, leaving the broken piece of Sunpiercer on the steps as proof that his path as a hero had ended before the throne. The walls of the White Court showed cities where towers had already completed their trials. In some worlds, winners had become new administrators. In others, only empty streets remained, with system windows still congratulating people when no one was left to receive the message. In a fragment caught by her map, Sora saw an ancient world that had refused to choose the strongest. Its people built Aegis Zero as an answer to the administrator's court, an item capable of returning judgment to the one who believed himself above the accused. Rael rose, and the white windows behind him began rotating like pages of a vast sentence. His golden eyes settled first on the shield, then on the cracks across Doyun's arm, and the hall answered with a low hum, as though recognizing an old error by its scars. One window opened to show Nayeon in a guarded sector of Seoul, sitting beneath white surveillance light with her school bag pressed to her chest. Doyun took one step forward, and every plate with law mirror turned toward the throne at once. Sora caught his sleeve in time because her map showed a trap around the window with Nayeon. The screen was not a connection, but a hook, and any direct movement toward it would give Rael grounds to classify personal attachment as a protocol threat. Rin vanished behind the column of windows, where white light cut her shadow into thin pieces. Her knives covered themselves in shadow runes, and she searched not for Rael, whom steel could not reach, but for the hall's fastenings through which the throne held the rules. The first wave of judgment moved from the throne in a smooth white circle. Law Mirror accepted it, and the black crack on Doyun's chest widened because Rael was striking not the shield, but the status of a person the system had already decided to call an error. Rael's next command aimed at Sora and Rin, bypassing Doyun as the shield owner. A white spear of law entered the hall with such speed that even time reversal echo could not wake in time, and Doyun made the one movement that required no calculation. He stepped between the spear and his allies, accepting the blow with all of Law Mirror at once. The shield split from rim to center, and the 100th crack crossed every older line, connecting poison, roar, time, bolts, spear, and system command into a single pattern. This time, the shield did not gather back into its previous form. The fragments hung around Doyun as massive mirrored slabs, rising in rows like fortress walls, while the system window tried several times to determine the rank and failed each time into white noise. From the cracks across his arm and chest grew black and white armor with smooth mirrored plates. Doyun stood at the center of the unfolding fortress, his eyes turning fully silver, until the system finally displayed the new rank, SSS rank Mirror Fortress. The White Court multiplied across hundreds of mirrored slabs, and every reflected throne pointed back toward Rael. For the first time, the administrator took one step back, not from fear of strength, but from fear of a law capable of returning to him the right to judge. Rael sat back upon the throne, and the windows behind him folded into a single sentence. Above Doyun flared the line, "Player deletion authorized," while Mirror Fortress opened wider, covering Sora, Rin, and Jihook, and the distant image of Nayeon inside one silver reflection. Rael began the final battle not with an attack, but with changing the gravity of the hall. The floor moved upward, walls became ceiling, and only Mirror Fortress held the correct direction around the group, creating a small island inside the chaos, where a step still meant a step. Doyun raised one wall of the fortress, and the gravity lines reflected back into the throne. The white windows behind Rael twisted, but the administrator merely turned his palm, rewriting space so quickly that the reflected law could not settle in place. The next command extinguished every skill except Doyun's. Sora's map fell into dim pages, Ren's knives lost their shadow, and Jihook remained holding the broken spear, fully separated for the first time from the system role that had been forced upon him. Mirror Fortress answered not by copying skills, but with walls. Separate mirrored plates opened around Sora, Rin, and Jiok, each carrying a crack from their past battles, and Doyun felt that now he protected people not with his hand, but with his own space. Rael changed tactics and opened before Doyun a white administrator crown. In the windows around it, Nayan left the guarded sector, Sora lost her curse, Ren laughed among rescued children, and all these images rested on one condition: Doyun had to take Earth's throne. The crown hung so close that its light rested on his face like a warm dawn. Doyun saw how easy the world could become if power stayed in his hands, and that very ease reminded him of the first lie inside the weapon hall. Sora touched her protective plate, and her white mark gained a small crack. Doyun felt it through the fortress like a warm heartbeat inside cold metal, and understood the crown might save people, but would leave the system with a new face. Mirror Fortress raised the wall between Doyun and the crown, reflecting the offer back into the empty throne. The white light did not die at once. It slid slowly down the mirror, as if power were searching for a crack through which it could still look like salvation. Rael folded the throne room into a labyrinth of windows where every passage led to a different version of judgment. Some windows erased Doyun's name, others separated him from the shield, and others displayed his allies as obstacles that should be removed for greater efficiency.
Doyun did not search for the correct passage. Mirror Fortress reflected the entire labyrinth at once, and between thousands of windows appeared a straight path of mirrored slabs, built not by Rael's rules, but by the memory of every blow the shield had endured before this. Rin, stripped of skills, threw an ordinary knife at the nearest system anchor. Mirror Fortress caught its reflection and multiplied the trajectory, turning the small human action into dozens of silver paths that sliced through the supports of the labyrinth. Jihyuk drove the broken Sunpiercer fragment into the seal where his vessel status had once been anchored. The white seal cracked, and through the gap appeared not victory, but a narrow road to Rael, bought by a man who had finally broken his own symbol. Sora folded the map pages with her hands because the skill no longer obeyed. The route looked crooked and unfinished, yet Doyun followed it without hesitation, trusting the person who made it more than any system line still trying to correct her. At the foot of the throne, Mirror Fortress spread behind Doyun like wings made of walls. Rael looked down at him from the height of the court, and the administrator's golden eyes no longer held calm judgment, but the irritation of a judge forced into the defendant's place. Then Rael released a command he had kept until the end: erase player from the system. The words did not move like magic or weapon force. They opened as a white absence that made every window in the hall turn toward Kang Doyun at once. Mirror Fortress gathered every plate before Doyun, but the deletion command passed through the outer walls because it was not searching for a body. It began erasing records, the name on his license, his traces in the Ark, the metro route, even the small reflection of Nayan inside the shield's memory. Doyun's black and white armor began turning transparent, and the silver in his eyes dimmed at the edges. Sora saw the map pages forgetting his route right in her hands, and dug her nails into the paper, trying to hold at least the line of his name. Rin and Jihyuk both moved without skills, reaching toward a person the world was beginning to misrecognize. Their hands stopped short of the central plate because the deletion did not push them away. It made the idea of helping him harder to remember. Sora pressed her palms against the central plate of Mirror Fortress and allowed her mark to open fully. The curse, tied to the same old protocol, flared as a bridge between map and shield, returning to Doyun one record that the deletion had not yet taken: the choice to protect. Inside the erasure, Doyun saw every accepted blow not as suffering, but as a path of contact with the world. The shield had not grown because he was chosen to endure. It had grown because each impact proved someone else had been allowed to remain standing behind him. Then, Mirror Fortress finally found the direction of deletion. The command came not from the sky, and not from the system as a whole, but from Rael's throne, where golden eyes held the source of the skill. Even an absolute sentence had a hand that sent it.
The fortress plates broke and turned one after another, each crack changing the command's angle by a fraction. The Deletion stopped moving toward Doyun and began traveling backward through the corridor of mirrors, returning to the source that had named another life removable. Rael's golden eyes widened for the first time. The reflected Deletion approached him not as an attack, but his own decision wearing his own authority. And in that moment, the white judge looked less like a god than a man who had never expected the law to answer. The command entered Rael, and his white mantle opened into thousands of windows trying to assign the Deletion elsewhere. Mirror Fortress held the line, and every reflected plate returned the same answer. The source was already found. The throne cracked beneath him, and the dead worlds behind the windows went dark, one by one. Rael's figure lost its edges inside the white light, and the court that had judged countless players became suddenly empty, as if its voices had never been anything but echoes. Rael tried to hold himself through the remaining windows, but the administrator's name vanished faster than he could create new rules. Last remained a golden crack in the air. Then it folded shut, leaving on the throne's place Doyun's reflection with a human brown glimmer in his eyes. Mirror Fortress restored itself slowly, not as a weapon facing the throne, but as walls surrounding the living. Sora's curse marks stopped spreading. Ren lowered her knives, and Jihyuk stood apart, alive, stripped of the role that had almost swallowed him. In Seoul, beneath the dome, every system window went dark at once, then opened again with a new line: Humanity Free Mode. The dome above the city did not vanish instantly. It cracked with dawn-colored lines through which real rain passed for the first time that night. Nayeon ran out of the guarded sector with other civilians, clutching her school bag to her chest. At the base of the Zero Tower, she saw Doyun in black and white armor, massive mirrored slabs behind him, and for the first time since the night had begun, his shield started lowering. When Nayeon reached him, Doyun lowered Mirror Fortress enough to embrace his sister with living arms. Dungeons, ranks, and dangers still remained above the city, but the Zero Tower could no longer turn people into expendable material, because between Earth and any new court now stood the Mirror Sovereign.